Hello everyone, this is Dr. Supriya Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya. I welcome you to the lecture number 1 of week 4, and the title of the course is Understanding Deconstruction, a Critical Approach. Here I am going with the present lecture with the title A Deconstructive Reading of Jane Eyre and White Sargasso Sea. Now, here in this particular lecture, we are doing a deconstructive study of both these novels. So let me come to the story so that you would be able to understand the text or the deconstructive reading in a better way. Now, let me tell you that Jane Eyre is a novel written by Charlotte Bronte. And here in this particular novel, when it begins, Jane Eyre is just 10 years old and she is living with her maternal aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her 2 daughters and a son, where she was treated not well by aunts or the other siblings. And further, she goes to Lowood School, where also she was not treated well by Mr. Brocklehurst, the administrative officer there. And she was supported only by 2 females. One is the teacher, Miss Temple, and other is Helen Burns, one of her friend. And from there, further, her journey goes to Thornfield Hall, where she was working as a teacher. And here you would find that she is now an adult woman. She falls in love with Mr. Rochester and she was equally responded by him. And further, she comes to know that Mr. Rochester already has a wife and therefore she denies marrying Mr. Rochester and she leaves Thornfield Hall. However, by the end, she comes back because Bertha Mason or the first wife died and she continues a happily marriage life with Mr. Rochester. Now, here when we are going with the deconstructive study of this particular text, we find that it is a novel by Charlotte Bronte, and here we are going to involve in the uncovering tensions and the contradictions, the instabilities in the novel. We would also look how the novel treats the idea of identity, morality, gender, colonialism, and the structure of binaries, particularly the binary between reason and passion, between self and other, master and slave, man and women, and even colonizer and colonized. Now, this way we first go on with a feminist reading of Jane Eyre, harnessing the deconstructionist tools. Here, first of all, we would be dismantling the hierarchy through the concept of the window seat. Now, here we find that this window seat has a significant in the very beginning because we find that Jane Eyre here sits on a window seat, drawing the curtain so that she cannot be looked by any member inside the house, and she could also peep outside from the window glass. So this way we find that this window seat is quite significant because it is making her in between the outside and inside. So here she first blurs the identity of outside and inside, and this way she dismantles the hierarchy. And it can be read as that this is the place where she can assert her identity, because since she is not treated well by any member in the house, therefore at least she is trying to get her own space. And we can here see it in the light of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. So here she has perhaps made a room for her own self where she is all free. Now here we also see that she is able to see the outside world, and this can be considered as a beginning for exploring the outside world, where she is not inside, rather she is in between position. And this can be seen in the light of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, where she says that the outside world is man's world. So here perhaps we are able to understand this, that from here the very journey for exploring the outside world begins. Now, this particular scene can also be interpreted in other way, where she is reading a book, Bewick's History of British Words. Now, when she's looking through the visuals of the book, it is actually a visual book. She found the colorful pictures of birds, and this bird particularly can be seen as trace. Trace is again a deconstruction tool where we find that bird can be seen as trace, where it indicates, you can say, wings or even Jane's future flight. Now, apart from this, we also see that John Reed's, one of the male member of the house, comes looking for Jane Eyre. He found that she was on the window seat and she was using a book which belongs to that house or which was the property of that house, and he knocked her at her head because he was asserting the masculine structure of power. And here we see that this masculine structure of power is displayed in his identity, because he was actually a social figure, though a child, but he was a social figure, and where he know that he is going to be the eventual inheritor of the house and its belongings, indicating how power commands the body and the performances as described by Judith Butler. So, being a male, he is performing as particularly a male in the social arena. Now, there is another idea, that is of the gleam of light. Here, it can be taken as or treated as trace again, because the idea of light that we see can go for knowledge, and this gleam of light is visible when she was locked in the red room. There she sees a gleam of light and she becomes faint. Now, here gleam of light can be seen as a knowledge which she gains, and with this gleam of light she gains a knowledge, and that paves the way for her future journey. So twice in the novel, one when she was locked in the red room, and the other when Bertha Mason comes up with a candle while she was sleeping just a day before her marriage. So both the times we find that this gleam of light has been used by Charlotte Bronte, and we can see it as a trace for knowledge, where she comes to understand something new, and this paves the way for her future venture. And we find that after this, she discovers a new way in her life. Now, apart from this, there is another trace, that is eyes. And this idea of eyes or beautiful eyes or a gaze in it has been used several times throughout the novel. And this way, we can take eyes again as a trace, particularly for gaze. Now, here the idea of gaze is quite important, because gaze is something that display power, and when we are talking of a male gaze, it means male power, and a female gaze can be seen as female power, therefore. And here we see that throughout the life of Jane Eyre, we find that several times we find this kind of shift of power through gaze. Initially, when she was in Reed's house, John Reed, who is the only only male member in the Reed's house, tries to assert his dominance over Jane through his gaze, but she tries to look or confront through her gaze. However, here she fails to do so because of the power that was supporting Reed's many a times, and there were many powerful people with John Reed's, and therefore she failed there. Now, in the next part of her life, when she was at Lowood School, we can find this binary between Mr. Brocklehurst and Jane. Brocklehurst was a man, bold, well built, tall, stout, and when he was trying to assert his power, she revolted through her female or feminine gaze, and that is why she was punished. And again, you will find that she failed to assert power over Mr. Brocklehurst. However, she was here pampered and favored and supported by Miss Temple and Helen Burns, where Miss Temple is one of the teacher of Jane and Helen Burns is one of the friend. Now, when her journey begins from there and she reaches Thornfield Hall, here we find Mr. Rochester, and Mr. Rochester too is one who was well built, a masculine man, a rich man, and he tries to assert her gaze. Many a times he has talked about the eyes of Jane, and this way we find that he was looking into his eyes and he was trying to assert her dominance upon Jane. And gradually we find that perhaps Jane gradually, in the gradual procedure of the novel, in the gradual course of the novel, she tames her gaze, and this way she was able to equalize this binary. And this way we find that Mr. Rochester becomes equal to Jane Eyre. Now here, from this point, we find that she further rejects Rochester, trying to overturn the hierarchy, and she leaves Thornfield Hall. She meets Rivers, and there, when River was also trying to take her on the mission of preaching the colonized people, there also she rejected this mission of Rivers, and this way she is not allowing Mr. Rivers to dominate over her. And this way we find the binary between this male and female coordination is also very much kind of dissolving, sort of, where none is powerful. Now, apart from this, when she feels a call by Mr. Rochester, she comes back, suppressing the rationality or the reason and allowing her emotion to flow. She comes back, and when she finds that the mansion is all burnt, and she comes to know that it is because of Bertha Mason, the early wife of Mr. Rochester, who burned the whole mansion, as well as she jumped from the mansion in order to commit suicide. So she died, and while saving her, Mr. Rochester too got crippled and blind, and now he is living somewhere else. Now, this way, when she went to Mr. Rochester, she is now trying to overturn the hierarchy, and she was successful in doing so. So, at this point of time, we find that gradually, from the suppressed position, she becomes equal, and gradually, in the due course of the novel, in the later phase of the novel, she is at the position which is the primary one. Because here we find that she is serving Rochester, she is writing a book, writing an autobiography, writing a self-narrative named or titled Jane Eyre. So she is writing her own story. This way she becomes a writer and he a mere reader, and even with the help of Jane Eyre, because he is now partially blind. So this way we find that gradually by the end she becomes superior, she overturns the hierarchy, she tames the gaze and reverses the gaze, redefines his gaze, and this way she is now considered as an individualist, a feminist, and this way Charlotte Bronte is successful in reversing the gaze, in reversing the situation, in reversing the binary, and she becomes an individualist feminist in this particular novel. Now, here when we move further to the another reading of this particular novel, that can be considered as a post-colonial perspective, where we find again a binary of self and other. And here we see that self is Jane and other is Bertha. So when we see that Charlotte Bronte is dealing with two females, one is Jane and the other is Bertha. Jane is considered as a woman who is able to assert her identity, whereas she is doing so at the cost of Bertha Mason, who is mad, savage, colonized, and so. Even in the essay by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, her essay Three Women's Text and a Critique of Imperialism, where she applies post-colonial deconstruction to Jane Eyre. Here we find that according to Spivak, Jane defines herself as an independent subject, or you can say that Charlotte Bronte enabled this particular Western woman to define herself as an independent subject, particularly in contrast to Bertha Mason, who is the racialized mad woman in the attic. And Jane's independence is at the cost of the silencing of this particular colonized object. Now, Bertha here function as others that Jane uses to shape her sense of self. She plays significantly in highlighting Jane's identity. And this way, Jane's selfhood is constructed only through these exclusions, especially Bertha, whose silencing and deconstruction are necessary for Jane's happy ending. Thus, the autonomous self of Jane is not actually autonomous at all, but it is built upon the colonial marginalization of another woman who is from Jamaica, that is Bertha Mason. Now, this way we find that the binary between self and other has been created, where Western women has been highlighted at the cost of a Jamaican woman. Now, this way we see that when we are going to look into the childhood days or the early days of Bertha Mason, we have another story, and there is a novelist called Jean Rhys. She has written a novel, White Sargasso Sea, where she has written a prequel. This particular novel is a prequel to Jane Eyre, and here she is narrating the story of Bertha Mason told by her own mouthpiece. Now we see that till now she was described by someone, but now she is describing her own self. And this way the binary is being dismantled, because till now Jane was asserting her identity, but now it is that Jean Rhys has given an opportunity to Bertha Mason to tell her own story. Now here in particular novel White Sargasso Sea, we find that it is a prequel to Jane Eyre, and here we come to understand or have the story not of Bertha Mason but of Antoinette Causeway, because Bertha Mason was actually Antoinette Causeway in her childhood, a Creole woman in post-emancipation Jamaica who is later known as Bertha Mason. And in between the journey from Antoinette Causeway to Bertha Mason, she is also Antoinette Mason. So this way gradually her identity shifted from Antoinette Causeway to Antoinette Mason and now to Bertha Mason. She was trapped between cultures and rejected by her English husband. Nowhere it has been told to us in the novel that he is Mr. Rochester, but we have been told that her husband is one who is called towards the land of Caribbean. Now here in this particular novel, we find that this novel does not respond actually to the novel Jane Eyre, rather it disrupts Jane Eyre, revealing the colonial, racial and gendered silences buried beneath Bronte's romantic narrative. In this particular novel, we find that there is again a binary. When we do a parallel study of Jane Eyre and Bertha Mason, we would find that Jane Eyre develops from a room to the outside world, whereas Antoinette Causeway was a woman living in was a girl living in a family where she was having so many slaves, and this way she was living in an open space, and gradually she was trapped in the room in the attic. And this way their stories or their lives are vice versa. One is opening up and the other is getting packed and closed into a room. And this is perhaps the reason why she got mad. Now this way we find that this novel also asserts the liminal identity of Bertha, where we find that her identity throughout from the very beginning is not clear. She was in between two poles throughout. as we come to understand that she was from Europe. She was of European descent, born in Jamaica, and therefore she is neither a white European nor a black Jamaican, rather somewhat in between the two. So she is from the very beginning having an identity of in between. Her childhood actually falls during the complexities of emancipation, with Emancipation Act which was passed in 1833. So this was a time when there was a tension between black slaves and whites authoritarian attitude. And apart from this, when we move further, we find that she was Antoinette Causeway in the very beginning. Then her mother married a man, Mr. Mason, and she becomes Antoinette Mason. And then she marries Mr. Rochester to become Bertha Mason. This way, even her name, which is something that is very much symbolic of identity, gets changed or shifts throughout. And this is one of the reason that impacted too much her psychology. Now, regarding relationship, we again find that she had no clear-cut relationship. Her father was a drunkard. He died very soon. Her mother was taking care of a brother who was suffering from cerebral palsy. So she was not able to show affection towards Antoinette. Brother was not physically fit. And after the death of the brother, mother became mentally ill. So this way she never got affection from father, mother or brother. And then she had only stepfather, a stepbrother, and a husband who was cold, who was with a cold colonial presence throughout, and he was perhaps sent here in Jamaica to secure wealth, and therefore he was confused by Caribbean culture, refusing Antoinette's any identity, and therefore he also renamed her as Bertha. Now, this way there are so many reasons, completely liminal identity she has, and this way we find that this can be understood as a reason where she is one who was unable to go with stable psychology. Now here the binary again gets unstable with when we see it in the light of Helen Chico's The Laugh of Medusa, because here we see that Bertha Mason becomes a woman who writes through her body in the absence of voice, autonomy or narrative space. So when she reaches Jane Eyre, when she reaches the later phase of her life, when she is in the novel Jane Eyre, she is one who has no voice, no autonomy and no space from where she can speak. Therefore, she spoke through her body. She does not had any language at that particular point of time because she was mad, and repetitively she was addressing as mad and savage, and therefore she lost all her identity, and this way her body becomes a site of expression of resistance and protest. She attacks therefore Rochester's brother, she destroys Jane's wedding veil, and finally burns down Thornfield Hall, culminating in her own death. And these are not just random acts of madness, rather they are bodily texts of rage, of pain and protest. Her madness becomes a metaphorical language of resistance when verbal language is denied. Now, this way we see that Bertha's act can be seen in the light of what Chico argues, that traditional patriarchal language has excluded women's voices, and therefore women must find some alternative ways to express themselves. And one of the main strategies she proposes is writing through the body, or écriture féminine. And here we find that she writes through her body, and what she does was just a mode of expression rooted in her experience and physicality. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak too writes in imaginary maps about Chico's idea of marginalized women speaking through their bodies, and by showing how women, especially from subaltern or oppressed communities, express their resistance, agency and trauma in ways that often go beyond traditional language. through bodily actions, silences, and non-verbal modes of meaning. So this way we come to understand that how these two novels can be deconstructed or can go with a deconstructive study. And in the further lecture, we would be moving to two short stories by Mahashweta Devi. One is The Breast Giver and the other is Draupadi. And we will be go with a deconstructive reading of these stories. So I would request you to at least go with a reading of it so that it would be better for you to understand the next lecture. Thank you.